Okay. Welcome to starting a nonprofit. The four fundamental steps. I have the great honor to be part of this team from SPS and the nonprofit management team. We have Lonnie, we have Madeline, we have Liz, and there has been an idea that has been there for several years. And we had the opportunity to put this together with the help of all professors or instructors that engage with us in giving you an extra support in terms of tools and in best practice of how to start and run a nonprofit organization. A couple of weeks ago, November 7, we had the first session where and we talk about the process of incorporating a nonprofit, about running initially a nonprofit, all the things that you need to put together. That video is available and all the materials from that presentation is available. And today we're going to continue with these sessions. We will have the presentation from John Hicks. I'm gonna introduce him in a second. And I just want for you to remember also that we have two more sessions. We have a session on January 30 that we're gonna talk about governance. And we have Ernera Walker. She's extraordinary. She will talk about governance. She will talk about the issue of discrimination and race in the nonprofit sector, how to make our boards more effective, and how governance has been one of the key to have a better sector in terms of more transparency, more oversight. We also have a session on March 13 with Tom Watson. And another important piece of this starting a nonprofit series is about communication, marketing, the impact, how we can be more effective in terms of marketing our organization. Today, we have the great honor to have with us John Hicks. He will talk about the effective fundraising, some tools for effective fundraising, and key steps that you need to put together to be a champion in terms of fundraising for your nonprofit or for the nonprofit that you have in mind. John Hicks is part of our team. He has been in our team for many years, and he's a part-time lecturer. He teaches grant writing, fundraising fundamentals for nonprofit. He's a principal chief strategy at DLBHICKS. More than 30 years of experience fundraising, supporting groups, supporting different organizations, providing consultation and strategic approaches and strategic guidance for annual and capital fundraising. He has been helping numerous nonprofit in terms of the board capacity, fundraising. He is also a certified fundraiser, and he was a member of the board of director of the AFP International and the president of AFP, the New York chapter, and he has been a member of the AFP for many years. It is an honor. We have a session ahead of us that's gonna bring different tools, different ideas, more in a time of COVID-19 that will require our organizations to be more effective in terms of reaching the goals that probably those organizations will have for the next year. This session, you're going to have the opportunity also to raise your question. There is a chat open for you also to bring any question that you have during the presentation. John is going to be answering the question, also provide an opportunity also to participate. Thank you very much, John, for joining us and having the time to share your expertise with this selected group of participants.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. That's a That's a heck of an introduction. It's a nice way to wake up on Saturday, everybody. So it's good to see all of you here. And this is going to be an interesting topic, not only because uh, anyone and everyone who's on this call who's in the process of starting up a nonprofit organization, or maybe your nonprofit is at an early stage of growth. I think that what we're going to try to do today is to explore, I think, two things, or try to address two of the challenges I think that startups face in fundraising. One is there is just the question of like, what kind of fundraising should I be doing? Because there's a lot of different ways to raise money, but I think that the real key here is finding the right way to raise money for your organization, and it's going to vary organization to organization. So what I'm going to be doing is introducing or reintroducing for some of you, if you will, the basic building blocks of fundraising, exploring how do we determine which ones will be most effective for us, but also having an eye towards ultimately you want to build out a structured, well planned, ongoing fundraising operation, because that's really going to be able to fuel your organization to grow from a startup to a next stage and ultimately a mature not-for-profit organization. So I thought where I would dive in here, and again, as Carlos mentioned, I do encourage you to please drop your questions into chat as we go, and we'll certainly build some breaks in to address some of those questions. I thought it might be, probably advantageous and appropriate just to start with addressing the question, what is effective fundraising? Because that can mean a lot of different things. Well, here's how I'm thinking about it. Um, you know, it's fundraising that gets the best results for you. So it means that it's effective if you're making the best use of what connections you have, what time you have, what energy you have, and what resources you have at your disposal. That's going to vary from organization to organization and situation to situation. So again, this goes back to what I was stating earlier, is trying to design fundraising that's going to, be able to make the best use of these different facets of your time and your resources and really your connections. Fundraising that builds lasting relationships. I think this is awfully, awfully, awfully important. And it's being borne out, by the way, with what we're seeing by way of how donors are responding during the pandemic. I mean, let's just go ahead and acknowledge that our conversation, our presentation this morning, is taking place during a perfect storm. We have a pandemic. We have associated with that pandemic an economy that is basically going up and down and up and down and up and down. And right now it seems to be going down. We also are raising money at a time of tremendous conversations about huge social issues. We're having overdue conversations about those issues. So there's a lot of moving parts right now. And so what we're seeing in the field, when you look at studies by the Association of Fundraising Professionals and other groups, um, one of the things that's being borne out is that charities that have built lasting relationships or have long-term relationships with donors are navigating the waters right now fairly well, because donors are staying with the charities they know, they trust, and they support. So huge lesson here for all of us, huge takeaway from our conversation today is, whatever you do to raise money, make sure that as you're bringing a donor on board, treating that donor as an investor, as a partner, and making that donor really a lifelong friend, because that is going to be basically the bedrock upon which you're going to be able to grow and sustain your nonprofit organization. And then the third piece is basically fundraising that makes leads to making a real difference. And you could argue, well, gee, doesn't all fundraising do this? Well, it does, but I think one of the things we have to be mindful of is that there's some money that comes with strings attached and money that doesn't have so many strings attached, and it's making sure that you're raising the right money for the right things. One of the challenges I think that startup organizations or early stage nonprofits face is that sometimes you'll have donors who come to you, and this could be government donors and foundation donors, even individual donors, who may have their own ideas about what you could be doing to make a difference. And the question is, do I take this money? Is this going to take my program in a different direction? A term that we hear a lot, you'll hear a lot, is mission creep. And mission creep just really means, are we taking money to do things that we are not really designed to do or intended to do? And then one day you wake up and say, "Gee, we have a pretty good amount of money, but we're not doing the work for which we were created or founded." So there's that push pull between what is your mission, what is your purpose, with what is the market going to invest in. And the idea here is, as we're talking through the different facets of fundraising and tools and techniques that you can create to drive your fundraising, is putting things together that have a purpose, so that you are really driving fundraising to do what you were designed to do. So those are really the three overview facets of effective fundraising we're going to try to get at. And if anything, this slide kind of serves as a lens through which to look at everything that follows, from looking at the giving landscape, which is where we're going next, all the way through, how do I design, how do I plan my fundraising, and how do I execute that fundraising. So I think a good starting point beyond this would be to look at, well, who gives money? And that's going to begin to get us to think about, well, what is my audience? Where should I be? So starting by taking a look at the giving landscape as a whole. So we're going to talk very briefly about private sector support, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about government support. So let's start with private support. So there's really the three, I always call it the three basic food groups of fundraising from private resources, which is money from individuals, money from foundations through grants, and grants or sponsorships from corporations. What's really interesting is when we look at giving by these three groups, and how does this break out in terms of percentages and weights? Well, luckily, there's a great resource that allows us to do this. Every year, there's a group called Giving USA. It's associated with the Indiana Center for Philanthropy, and the Giving Institute, which is a group of fundraising consultants. And every year, they publish an annual report, so to speak, on the state of American philanthropy, and it's called Giving USA. So if we look at the most recent set of data from Giving USA, and this is from the report from June 2020, and then so this is based on actual giving, reported giving for the prior year. So this is really looking at 2019 giving, but here's the 2020 report. I mean, what we're going to see here is, and I'll do the quick math for you, it's roughly about $450 billion given to charity from independent or private resources. And every year, year in, year out, that they do this report, giving by individuals leads the pack. So the predominant source of dollars from the private sector for nonprofit organizations is and has been and likely will be giving by individuals. So, one thing that we have to take into consideration is that, really our biggest marketplace are people like you and like me. And so, of course, the question is, are we able to tap into those resources? Giving by foundations comes in second. Probably not too surprising, because foundations are largely, they really are in the business of giving money away. So foundations are clocking in at around 17% of overall philanthropy. Giving by bequest, and this is giving that comes out of estates, trusts, and wills, comes in at roughly 10%. And this is the kind of money that it really doesn't fall into our world so much for startup organizations, unless someone has left you money in a bequest to start up a charity. And believe it or not, that does happen, but it's pretty rare. A lot of giving by bequest goes to institutions that have a fairly long track record, like universities like Columbia, or hospitals, or very well established not-for-profits. And trailing at the end is giving by corporations, which clocks in at roughly 5% of overall philanthropy. What's interesting is that that's a pretty constant number year in, year out. And also, it's always interesting, maybe even slightly amusing, depending on who you are, to note that giving by bequests always outpaces giving by corporations. So as I say to my classes at Columbia, and those of you who have taken my classes always hear me say, yep, dead people give more than corporations. There's a bit of a reason for this, because corporations are not in the business of philanthropy, they're in the business of business. And so therefore, a lot of profits from corporations are distributed back to shareholders, or possibly reinvested into products and services. So corporations may not have as much money to give away, but believe it or not, some of their giving shows up under giving by foundations, because corporations sometimes create corporate foundations. Where does all the money go? And I won't walk through each of these categories, but you'll see in the right-hand column. Incidentally, there I think this deck will be made available to everyone through the site, so not to worry, you'll be able to have these slides. But you'll always see in this that essentially giving to religion and education, 29%, 14%, that always leads the pack, because basically houses of worship and religious institutions and educational institutions are constantly asking for money. That's probably the most important lesson you can take from that right-hand column. The more you ask, probably the more you get. And so therefore, religion, education, always drives the most of the giving. Also, here's something else to think about, is that with religion and education, these are participatory activities. Giving to an alma mater, even to a kid's alma mater. And certainly if you belong to a faith community, there's something participatory about that, obviously. So therefore, having experiences with donors can actually translate into giving. And that's probably something we should be looking at is, how do we have experiences with donors? And of course, one of the challenges right now that we're facing with that is that, we're having experiences just like the one we're having now, which is online. So are there ways to, create these experiences? Lastly, from Giving USA, and I always look at this because I think it just gives you, again, a perspective on giving. They've tracked giving since 1979. So, you have here, roughly about 40 years worth of information on giving. And as you can see, there's clearly an uptick in giving over the long term. I mean, giving normally tends to go up. Sometimes there might be a decline. And by the way, anytime you see these recession bars, I always call them the recession bars. Ironically, they're in gold. They absolutely will tie to different events. I mean, there was a recession in 1991. There was the tech bubble burst in 2000, followed really, unfortunately, by 9/11, and then there was the Great Recession of 2008. But if you'll notice, really, giving has recovered every time there was a recession. Is that going to be true for 2020, 21, 22? Really, we don't know, because we don't really know what the long-term effects of pandemic plus the economic challenges that we're facing are probably going to have on philanthropy. I mean, this is why these reports by Giving USA can be very insightful, but we're going to get the next report in 2021, and we'll see what happened in 2020. Our next sort of major group of donors and let's just say money worth exploring, and I think you do have to explore this as a startup, is government funding. So believe it or not, even as a startup charity, sometimes you can be in a space where you qualify for government support. And government support, and we're talking really, we're talking at these local level, a state level, a federal level. The bottom line is there's just more money there. I mean, this is the biggest amount of money that's out there and available for nonprofit organizations. It always has been and probably always will be, because this is money that's really driven by tax dollars. So we have lots of people paying taxes into the system, and those taxes sometimes and a lot of times are reallocated in grants back to the third sector. That's folks like us. So we almost think of ourselves as contractors. Now, I don't have a nifty set of charts and graphs that I can share with you on government funding. I can share with you a couple of numbers that at least illustrate, what the potential is, and this is where I'm going to start. If we look at federal support for the year 2019, I mean, the total amount given in grants and contracts, $1.8 billion. We're talking about more than three times the money that was given away by private sector donors. Um, One department, HHS, $531 billion. That number alone outpaces all philanthropic giving by individuals. So one of the things I think realistically we have to look at is government money available? It may be, it may not be. It's going to really depend on your organization, your mission, your program, your connections. There's a lot of intangibles, but I don't think that we could really have a presentation that talks about effectively raising money for your charity if we don't at least take into consideration giving by government. So with federal support, we have a lot of different streams that one can look at. I mean, basically, there's 26 major departmental funding entities at the federal level. I mean, you have anything from USAID, if you're working internationally, up to the Department of Agriculture. And then you have a lot of smaller grant programs. I mean, things like the Appalachian Regional Commission or the Inter-American Foundation grants. I mean, so there's tons of little programs scattered all over the federal government. Um, Going to a resource, and we're going to talk about this, grants.gov, could give you a bit of an introduction to this. On the state and local level, we certainly can be looking at different kinds of giving, but it's going to vary by state, commonwealth, municipality. The bottom line, it kind of depends on where you're situated and how much money is in the state coffers or the local coffers. And it's usually made at a department or an office level. And again, how much money is available is going to vary on circumstances. And this, by the way, is where the pandemic is having an impact. So probably not surprisingly, if you're a nonprofit organization operating in the state of New York or even the city of New York, you're going to find that a lot of the agencies have less money. I mean, the Department of Education is scrambling to spend more money because kids are now learning online, and needless to say, the State Department of Health, the City Department of Health, I mean, they have been enormously impacted by the first wave of COVID back in the spring. So we have to pay attention to what these opportunities are and kind of what's going on. Um, Looking at elements, and now we're going to get into where the rubber meets the road. The essential elements of effective fundraising. And I've enumerated a few different topics that we're going to explore individually. One is we're going to be looking at, how do you develop a case for support? Because you have to be able to answer the question, why you and why now? Um, Finding logical funding partners, this goes back to the comment earlier, is figuring out what's the right way for your charity to raise money, what's going to be the right constituency, where should you be focusing your time and your efforts. Fundraising goals, how do you set fundraising goals? How do you even begin to think about how much money to ask for? And I've got a pretty simple little matrix or construct that might help you think about that. The right campaign activities. So what kinds of things are we going to do? What are going to be the activities? Where are we going to spend time and resources and energy? And we're also going to talk about how do we build out a team and how do we create an action plan. So if we can put like all of these different building blocks or pieces of the puzzle together, ideally we can come up with a fairly effective way of raising money for our charity. Where we're going to start is developing a case for support. Because I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't have a reason to ask for money and you haven't really thought through, well, what is my pitch, and how can I convince someone, how can I inspire someone to support my charity, it's going to be very, very tough to raise money for your charity. So having a case for support is really the first thing that you tend to work on. So again, anyone, and then we have a few people. I've kind of scanned the participant list a little bit as I've gone. I know there's a few veterans of my fundamentals of fundraising class here today, and we know we started by talking about case for support. The case is going to basically say why your organization like needs money. Why do you need my philanthropic support? How am I going to feel good about giving money to you? What you're going to use my money to do. So, do you have a need or challenge to be addressed? By the way, another thing that you might want to also consider talking about is, do you have opportunities that can be realized? So, sometimes it isn't just about meeting a need, it's about, I have an opportunity to make some real lasting change. What programs or activities are you looking to pursue in the next, say, 12 to 24 months that my money is going to help make possible? And what kind of results will you be looking to achieve as a result of my giving money to you? Um, a competitive case statement interprets this message in the context of the current market. Well, that's kind of a mouthful, isn't it? What I'm really talking about here is relevance. Why is the work of your charity important right now? So, needless to say, one of the things I think every organization, I don't care if you're a startup organization or you are the Environmental Defense Fund, you've been around for years, the relevance question is huge. So, in terms of how do you interpret your work in the context of pandemic or social unrest or the challenges faced by this country in terms of economics or just the healing process that we all are trying to go through as a society. So I think that the organizations, and this is just an observation in my own work, looking across different nonprofit organizations, but the ones who are really able to raise money, or I feel are doing a good job of raising money, are the ones who are basically answering this question: why us? Why now? Why is this our time? A case statement is going to address this. It's going to help you answer this. It's going to give you essentially something you can hand to a donor that donor can read. It's going to inform the content of any of your grant applications. So what it does is it gives you aspirational and inspirational language that helps really drive the funder or the donor to want to support your project. The basic elements, the basic building blocks of a case statement, and this is from my good friend and colleague, Andrea Kilstad, would be that you always start with really, what is your vision? So every single one of you here, you have a vision for your charity. There's a reason that you are creating a nonprofit or have created a nonprofit. What is the problem or the challenge? What is your plan to solve that problem or the challenge? How much is it going to cost? Why do you need to do this now? And the call to action, which means inviting the funder or the donor to come in and be part of the solution. Here's another thing I think you have to think about when you're formulating a case statement. One of the I think this is really like one of the, I might even call this the paradox of philanthropy. Because if we think about philanthropy, philanthropy is largely about what? It's about pursuing ideas and dreams that really make the world a lot better and leave the world a lot, leave the world better off than we found it. And that's great. I mean, that's idealistic, and we have some lofty aspirations. But here's what I think we know about donors, especially when you start asking donors for larger sums of money. And I'm going to quote a consultant by the name of Russ Allen Prince. Russ Allen Prince defines a major gift as a gift of such size that the donor feels risk writing the check and or you feel risk taking it. So a case statement, if you have all of this written out, what you're beginning to do is to put into words, a rationale for giving that hopefully helps the donor feel less risk. So a lot of this is overcoming risk. And this is going to be awfully, awfully, awfully important for a startup organization when you don't have a track record and really the donor is being asked to invest in you and your team and your ideas. So you have to be able to walk in. It's almost like, imagine you're going on Shark Tank. This is your Shark Tank pitch, to get the funding that you need to start up. So that means that in creating a case for a new charity, I think these are the things you have to think about. Is the problem you're trying to solve unique? How big is the program? And these two kind of go hand in hand, and it gets at something that I think is awfully important to donors, and that is scale. Um, One thing that will tend to get a donor to shut down, foundations do this all the time, is when they have a palpable sense that a nonprofit is asking for grant funding to solve a problem that's just way too big. So I think the message here is not talking about how you want to change the world. It's about how do you want to change your piece of the world. So if you can convince the donor that you have your hands around a piece of the world where you can make a difference, that's something tangible. You're going to ask for probably an appropriate amount of money, ask for an appropriate amount of risk, and therefore the donor is going to feel very good about writing the check. So therefore, are you the right size to offer the solution? Short-term goals, I think, are really important in a case statement, especially for a startup charity, because the tangible question comes back to that word tangible that many donors will ask is, where do you expect to be a year from now or 2 years from now? Not 5 years from now, because you're brand new. So what is your plan to get out of the gate and be able to do the program that you're doing and raise the money you need to raise and build the resources you need to build? So I think looking at short-term time frames is awfully important for case statements for a startup. So therefore, where do you see yourself? Maybe 12, 24, maybe 36 months if you have a really clear sense of this. What resources are you bringing to the table? So in starting up, what do you have in your corner? Is it expertise? Is it experience? Is it efficiency? You have this great idea to do a program that's going to work very efficiently and get a lot of, if you will, bang for the buck from a donor. And then finally, how are you going to put your donors' money to effective use? And this is going to get back into the question about how do you set fundraising goals and how do you plan to use the money? Again, this is very akin to walking in and looking for venture capital. Um, think about, again, there's the Shark Tank model, but there's similar models where you have to walk into a group of investors and you've got about 5 to 10 minutes to make your pitch. So you have to really drill down to what's the demand for my product and how much is it going to cost me to produce and how much money do I think I'm going to generate. And if we get through this startup phase, what comes next? So those are fundamental questions that can be adapted for a new charity. And as an aside, we are posting some associated resources for this webinar to the site, and we'll give you a link for that. And one of them I've added in here is the No Nonsense Guide to Writing a Case Statement by Jerry Panis, who was one of the absolute deans in our world of fundraising and probably wrote the best single short document on how to write a case statement. So even though this document was written years ago, the principles are all there. It's a pretty quick read. I would let this document be your guide in formulating your case statement. The next, I think, issue is, say we have a case for support and we kind of know why we need the money, and now we have to know who's going to read it. Where are we going to share this case around? So therefore, the second thing we need to do is identify the right funding partners. So, the name of the game here is determining where we're going to make the best use, again, of time, energy, and financial resources to get the best possible return. And so the two parts of the exercise, there's an easy part Where do you have the most reach now? The harder part is figuring out how do you build out donor markets. So if we take the easy part of the equation, um, again, and I'm sorry I keep coming back on using the startup business model, but I think there's a lot of parallels, if you will. A lot of charities start out basically with what you would call a friends and family round, that you go to those who are closest to you. You can ask them for certain amounts of money or pledges. You may be putting your own money into this, but that's the first round of funding. And if you're able to raise money and you have enough to get your program up and running, that begins to show a track record to the next round, which would be funders whom you don't know. So one place I sometimes see startup organizations where an error that I see startups make is that the charity will spend a lot of time trying to figure out, well, how do I get the Gates Foundation to give me a grant? Or even maybe it just is the large local community trust. I mean, we have to figure out how do we get this funder to give us a grant? And that might not be the best way to be spending the time, as opposed to who are the first 15 people I can call for modest contributions that can get me into business. I have a couple of organizations that I work with as a consultant who are really in startup growth mode or startup mode, but moving rapidly into growth. And in both cases, the right audience for these two charities is corporate America. And what I think they've done extraordinarily well is they focused their fundraising efforts, like laser focused, on going to corporations, because right now they have a great corporate pitch. At some point, foundations may be part of the mix, but foundations will happen once they have taken their program, they've piloted, they've tested, kicked the tires on it, and then once they have a proven model with data, this is what foundations like, they can go to foundations for a next round of money to help scale the project and bring it, along. Also, individuals could be part of that mix as well. So, thinking through where you have access and where easy money can come first, I think is like something awfully important to spend time doing before you just start going out and raising money. And understanding that even though all of the textbooks on the topic of fundraising will usually go back to that, remember the Giving USA chart, and say that, well, 70% of your money can come from individuals and 20% can come from grants. It's going to be different for every organization. So, for example, this is one of my clients, and they've been in business for about 6 years. And this is how their funding breaks out. I mean, they get 63% of their money from the government, and they get 11% from foundations and 3 from corporations, and they have like a small little sliver of money from individuals, 2%. Well, they're not getting 67% of their money from individuals because that's just not where they have reach. They also have a little bit of earned income, and they have, for what they do, in-kind support is important. And that means they get a lot of donated technology and services, and that helps really with the bottom line. So, part of thinking about your funding mix is, again, thinking about where do you have access, what donors might be most receptive to what you're trying to do, and it's probably trying those areas first, and therefore, determining which of the markets is going to make the most sense. So again, access, who's going to be most responsive to your case, where do you have connections? This is either through your own Rolodex or through your board or other folks who are working on your team, or maybe you have some early stage donors who can get you to other donors. So 6 degrees of separation usually does work, or friends. And therefore, putting in the appropriate time to get the best yield. I'm going to stop there and see, Carlos, maybe this might be a good little moment to take a quick Q&A break, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, perfect. We have you have the chat there for additional questions. We had the first one. Here's how we can realistically raise money if your organization doesn't provide direct service. When most donors, funders are investing most of their dollars right now for COVID response recovery. So how we can, this question is basically how, what is the best approach right now under these circumstances if you don't provide services?
Okay, no, that's a tough one, but it's an appropriate question. So first of all, even though yes, there's a lot of money that's being given away for COVID relief, and it's being tracked and incidentally, if you want to see where this money is being given and who is giving the money and where the applications are, I would invite you to go over to Candid, CANDID.org, and check out their website. They're actually tracking COVID giving, so you get a sense of it. But one of the things we've noticed, particularly with foundations, is that a lot of foundations have not necessarily taken their entire grant programs offline. Most foundations are just creating parallel giving. So, you might have like one pot of money that's being given to COVID, but still they're doing mission-based philanthropy. So don't, you know, I'm really going to encourage everyone here not to go away from our conversation today thinking that if you don't have a COVID-related project, you can't raise money. I think the challenge that was maybe raised by the person who posted the question is, what if you're not doing direct service and maybe you're doing something else? I think this is where you have to find the value proposition, meaning, and I guess I'm going to call it relevance, which is if you're not creating or providing direct service, are you undertaking research or are you producing some sort of output that might be helping nonprofit organizations do their jobs differently or better? I call this the BASF proposition. We don't make the ball bounce. We don't make the ball. We make the ball bounce higher. So the question is, do you have that value add? Also, it may be one of the challenges you could be facing right now is that it's really almost impossible for you to deliver your service in a traditional way, but there might be some creative ways of finding partnerships. And just as an aside on this, I had an opportunity back in May to spend some time with members of the League of American Symphony Orchestras. And you want to talk about a group that had been impacted by COVID. All the concert halls are shut down. So therefore, they've got a bunch of musicians sitting around and we can't really perform. I mean, we were large ensembles. So one of the things we talked about in conversation is how these orchestras might be potentially partnering with local direct service charities, education charities, finding ways of getting their musicians either individually or in small groups online to provide an opportunity for people in the community to interact through art. I said, so it's you're going to still be in the performance business. You're just going to be doing something that's a bit different. The main thing is keeping yourself in front of your audience. So that was one, idea that came up. And, the great thing was after that conversation, a few weeks later, a couple of participants, just anecdotally, we heard that they had been able to engage a couple of foundations to, think with them on this and even provide some funding. So I'm sorry, a very long answer to your your brief question, but it's an awfully good one.
No,
Thank you.
it's a good one. It's about also innovation in these times. It's having clear what is the goal that you have, how you can contribute, thinking about your market, who you are your beneficiaries, and also your donors, and so also getting to your donors. So that's why one of your best advice is knowing what you can provide and knowing your donor in advance and advocate for your cause. That's very good. We have another question here. Should foundations also provide programming or service, or should the focus only be philanthropic?
I'm not sure. I mean, not sure I understand the question. Are you meaning if it's an operating foundation, or?
Well,
I mean,
probably it's about the role of the foundations and and
Right.
they provide programming or
All right.
service, or
Hmm.
they just need to just focusing in the
Okay.
philanthropic approaches. So
Okay.
it is, and maybe it is this dual a role that some foundations like the National Endowment for Democracy and all the foundations they have, that they
Yeah.
provide funding, but at the same time they implementing it. Maybe it's that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Carlos. I think what we're looking at here, there's a distinction between a private foundation, which is chartered to give money away. So our job is to find charities and write checks. And then there's a foundation type that's called an operating foundation, where the foundation really exists to do two things, which is to raise money to provide direct service programs, but they may also have a giving arm. So one foundation comes to mind for me is the Muscular Dystrophy Association. I mean, believe it or not, it's a foundation because they provide 50 to 100 million dollars a year worth of research funding for neuromuscular disorders, but they are also providing direct service programs. So there are far more private foundations than there are operating foundations. So you'll encounter both, but predominantly when you look at the foundation community, in the U.S., most foundations are there for really the purpose of philanthropic support. All right.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's another question here. If you want, we can wait until the end for we have several questions here, so we can just bring two more and then wait till the end for
That
the
sounds
rest.
that
Okay.
sounds good. Bring them on. We'll
Okay.
move on then. Go ahead.
They, are there any external resources to get better at institutional grant application? Anyone provides feedback on unsuccessful grant application? So if they want to see if there are more sources available. And there's another one that we can answer immediately. That is a website where it's available grants, contract, yeah, grants.gov. All the grants are there, contracts, and it's really good source, grants.gov. So the other one, external sources to get better institutional grant application.
Yeah, I think the one-stop shopping resource on this is Candid. Candid is formerly the Foundation Center, but they merged with GuideStore last year. But they have an entire part of their online presence that is completely devoted to providing best practice information and grant seeking. So you can find examples of proposals with funder feedback. They also have any number of free programs that I would encourage you to avail yourselves of some of that programming as well.
Okay,
So you can kind of get it on both sides.
good.
All right. Should I continue?
Well, if you want, let's deal with this question, and then
All right. All
they're
right.
gonna have opportunity. How much important is to have in kind donations? What companies can companies be more it's easier for companies to contribute with in kind instead of direct funding? That's one of the. Another question is how can a family foundation raise money after the initial round of funding from the family members? It is the same process as charities. And the last one is a similar. Is for organizations that are multi-generational, the leadership is entering a new generation, so funders are retired. It is common practice to review the mission, the vision, how the new generation of donor can may identify with the organization, and that's the approach, how we can start the bequest conversation for traditional donors who has been retired for a while. So
Right.
those are the last questions.
Okay, that's good. So I might take these in reverse order.
Okay.
Actually, in a way, the last two kind of somewhat go hand in hand. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the question, I mean, first of all, with family foundations, I mean, after essentially you've gotten the money from the estate or the family puts their money in, yeah, sometimes family foundations will actually raise money with the intent of giving the money away. So, I mean, you may see family foundations that are, before the pandemic, we're running an annual fundraising event. fill in the blank ball in New York City, and then people come in for an evening, and maybe they raise $300,000 or $400,000, and that really goes into the family foundation. It's a tax deductible gift for attendees, and then the board of that foundation can make decisions on where to give the money away. And that model still is happening. It's happening online. I just actually got an invitation to an online event from a family foundation. So yeah, I think that to perpetuate a family foundation, continuing to raise money is probably a good idea. You can continue to grow. I mean, unless you just have like one single resource, like Bill Gates just happened to have this company called Microsoft that helped him kind of blow up his own family foundation to where it is today. As far as the question about next generation engagement, I this is such an important like question. Thank you for asking. As a matter of fact, I mean, I probably should have found a way to include this link somewhere, but I've spent a fair amount of time over the last year doing a webinar for some different groups, and there's a couple of links where you could actually watch it if you want. And the topic is engaging next gen leaders and foundations. And you raised some really great points about when you have a new generation coming in and making changes in terms of how the foundation operates and looks at the world. And like one example I use is the El Pomar Foundation in Colorado, where the next gen leadership, so basically the kids, began running the foundation. Mom and dad started the foundation just to do good community work. And for years, they were a great, just general operating support foundation. Send them a letter, they could send you a check. And I'm using a quote from a news article, an interview with the son coming in to run the foundation, who is then saying we're going to start looking at charities in the same way that venture capitalists are looking at businesses. So that's a different lens, and it's a different way to engage. So I think that part of it is honestly staying in communication with the foundation and just paying attention to how they are changing their guidelines and the kind of information they're looking for. I mean, if they're starting to ask you to provide things like more information on goals, objectives, and outcomes, that means the foundation is thinking very strategically at a return on investment level. And therefore, you got to start thinking about your program in that way if you're going to continue to engage them. But I'll try and see if I can get this link somehow added into the resources. The very first question. I'm so sorry, Carlos. What was the first one that you had posed before the family foundation question?
Was a is that there any external resources to get better institutional grant applications? We talk about the possibilities, resources for grant researchers. How much important is to have in-kind donation?
Oh yeah,
Uh,
in-kind donations. Yeah, thank you. If it makes sense for your charity, I mean, I'm all for it. For example, I have a number of clients who are in the education space, and they are trying their darndest to get donated technology. So, like, this is the right time to be asking for in-kind support in that way. I think as long as you're able to manage the in-kind support, I mean, what it really comes down to is if you're going to ask for in-kind support, make sure that you're going to get what you actually need. Sometimes companies will come and offer a ton of product, but it's product that doesn't have anything to do with your mission. And then all of a sudden, you've got the responsibility for either using the product or redistributing, which is French for give it away to somebody else. And then you've got a logistical nightmare on your hands. So I think thinking through very carefully what kinds of donations you'll accept. Have a gift acceptance policy for in-kind donations, so that if a company is coming and they're offering something and you really can't use it, you might be able to point to that policy and say, well, we really appreciate your generous offer, but here's our policy and these are the things that we can actually take on.
Yeah, excellent. That the last one, and then we close and reopen again
Okay.
at the end. Can a nonprofit seek donations specifically for the purpose of investing in order to increase funding? So this is the question: is if you can raise funds to create your own private foundations and having probably it's an endowment, create your own endowment and how to operate, and if that is feasible to
Yeah, I mean,
and yeah.
so it's basically, can you raise money for purposes of endowment, like in setting up
Yeah.
an endowment or a foundation? And the answer is yeah. I think I'm going to respond to this question in the context of our topic today, which is effective fundraising for startups. It is very, very, very rare that you are going to find an organization that is at a startup phase being able to put together an endowment. Endowments usually happen after an organization has reached a certain level of maturity, because endowment gifts tend to be what you call lifetime gifts. So you have a donor who's given money to you over years. That donor is beginning to look at retirement, and they're going into retirement planning and estate planning, and they want to leave something to you as a legacy. This is why Columbia University can get endowments. I mean, university's been around for a while. Hospitals can get endowments or can set up endowments. Startups, the only time I've ever encountered a startup organization, this is once in my entire career, where essentially, think of it this way: the donor started the charity, and one of the first things that she did was that she took $10 million out of her own estate and went ahead and set up the endowment. So it came totally from inside the organization, came from the founder. Um, Outside of that, it's probably difficult to get that money in the beginning stages. But go back to what I said, like right from the beginning when we talk about effective fundraising. If you build lifetime relationships with your donors, there's going to be a point down the road where you may be able to offer to a donor who is going into retirement or retirement planning or estate planning the opportunity to help set up endowment. So it'll happen. It may not happen, as early on in your organization's history as you might want it to happen, but it can happen. Um, Somehow that makes an interesting segue because it is getting us back to thinking about, well, where are my markets? Where can I raise money? Where should I put the shovel in the ground? Or where do I build out from where I am today? So just taking a look at some separate markets and what's going to possibly make sense. Now you'll notice under government grants I have my little angel and devil, because trust me, there's two sides to the equation. This can be easy money because they have the most money, as I mentioned earlier. And generally, the largest single grant awards will come out of government entities. So 6-figure, 7-figure, 8-figure grants are not uncommon. On the other hand, these grants require a high level of detail. And it's the difference between writing a grant proposal for the government and a private foundation is truly night and day. I mean, yesterday, one of the associates in my firm had to drill down with one of our clients a government request for a proposal that was 150 pages long. You just don't see things like this out of the private sector. Government grants can definitely help you build your reputation. So meaning that if you're able to secure a government grant, um, you're on the radar screen, so to speak. So saying you have a health and human services grant, carries a lot of credibility. But these grants also require a lot of financial reporting, and sometimes you may be reporting to the government funder over a course of years. So this means there's, as I always say to my clients, the good news is you got a grant, and the bad news is you got a grant, because there's a lot of reporting. Government grants can be highly competitive, and just a little tip here. Carlos mentioned grants.gov, and that's a great place to identify funding opportunities. But one of the things to pay very close attention to when you read a funding opportunity is A, how much money do they have to give away? And two, how many grants are they going to award? So sometimes I'll get a client who calls me up and says, hey, there's this great request for proposal from the USAID, and we would be perfect for it. And then I take a look at the RFP, and they're saying, okay, we're going to give $5 million, but we're going to give it to one agency. Whenever I see this, what I know is that 9.5 times out of 10, they already know who they're going to support. They've just put the RFP out there because they're required to, because you have to make it an open process. But they've already chosen their grantee. So in this case, I went back to the client and said, they have one grant available, and they're going to give that money to someone else. We shouldn't spend our time working on the application. Let's go try and find other money. Some grants require matching funds. I mean, that's another thing to think about, because you can get money from the government, but they don't give you a check until you've raised other money. Question is, do you have the bandwidth to do that? Again, government grants themselves can be just lengthy, complicated in terms of what you have to write, what you have to present, how you have to manage it. Some are based on reimbursements, which means that you have to make the outlay and we pay you back. I mean, this is one that a lot of agencies run into, where essentially, you get a grant from the federal government or the city government or the state government to launch a program, and you have to reach into your own pocket and pay for it for 6 months before you start seeing the invoices that you've submitted to the agencies coming back to you in the form of a check. So I would just be really careful in looking at these different facets of government grants before you decide to dive in. If it's something where they can write you a check, it's a pretty simple process. It's probably worth pursuing. If it's a contract where you're not going to get paid immediately, might not be the right place for you. With regard to individuals, and we've been talking about individuals, I mean, the largest constituency, and they do give any and all levels. Individual donors tend to stay with an organization over time. So again, I said this at the top, they tend to be the most loyal. We've seen this in the pandemic. With individual donors or donations, a lot of the giving decisions are driven by emotion. So I think in order to raise money from this constituency, you have to have really good storytelling. And we're going to explore this a little bit when we talk about direct mail and online fundraising. And with individual funds, if someone's writing you a check for each year for an annual fund, a lot of this money comes without strings attached, so you don't have to use it for specific purposes. This is where you can raise money that will keep the lights on and keep the electricity flowing and keep your rent paid. So individual giving, if that's going to be your audience and that's where you have reach, that's worth the investment. A number of you had questions about foundations, which makes a lot of sense, because foundations, again, this is a group that's in the business of giving money away. It's really the second largest donor constituency by total giving. Many are definitely accessible through an application process. I mean, so you can identify foundations through candid.org, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, how you do that. And you can certainly submit grant applications. Getting their attention takes a lot of time and patience. So this is not the fastest funding you're going to encounter. I mean, you'll send proposals into a foundation and they could be sitting on top of it for a decision anywhere from, a few weeks, maybe for a fairly small, modest grant, but for a large grant, the foundation could be hanging on to your proposal and not taking it to a board for a full year. So basically, the payoff can be really big, but understanding that most of the money given by foundations does come with restrictions. That's where it's different from individual giving. As a matter of fact, I mean, according to Candid, when you look at foundation giving over the last, say, 2 years, roughly 76 cents out of every dollar donated by foundations went for a specific purpose. So that means 24 cents out of the dollar, 24% of all giving from foundations was made for unrestricted purposes. So foundation giving is really there to support your programs and support your activities and support your products, support your research. So you have to, this is basically, you have to walk in with a business plan and a roadmap and a purpose. Corporations, which is of course our smallest donor constituency, giving is not their business, as we mentioned earlier. Their giving is largely motivated by profit, visibility, and relationships. And this means that by supporting the community, the company is actually going to look really good. It's part of what's called a corporate social responsibility agenda, CSR. And this is why a lot of times, with corporations, they may want to give product to build visibility for the product. The other thing that they're looking for is visibility. So is there a way that you can help promote that corporation as a good citizen, or is just basically being associated with your charity good business for them? And the other thing that corporations a lot of times are looking for are volunteer opportunities for their employees, which is a part of building out good corporate culture. Um, Identifying these resources, and this is what Carlos and I were kind of going back and forth on a little bit earlier. When it comes to foundation corporate funding, I mean, you can actually get to Candid. They're still using the foundationcenter.org website. So I put it up here intentionally so that you can try candid.org or foundationcenter.org. You can also, go into a library and use like LexisNexis, or at Columbia Nexus Uni, possibly to, identify some foundation resources. With regard to individuals, this is tough because there's not a lot of publicly available information on individual giving because it's really private. There's a reason to call it private philanthropy. But sometimes organizations get lists from similar charities. So every time you go to a gala, you bring home the program and you look at who else is supporting that charity, and maybe you would know some of those people as well. Paying attention through the media who's giving money, board volunteer connections, and events are actually quite good. And hopefully we're going to get back to where we're doing them in person again, because it's a great way for board members to easily bring people to a party to get to know you, and therefore you can get to know them. So these are really great on ramps for individual giving. With regard to Candid, I mean, it is the nation's largest resource on grants. The training programs I mentioned, I will, definitely, are worth mentioning again, because a lot of them are free and they're doing them online, but you can get a good basic education on foundation philanthropy and grant writing through Candid online. They also have something called the Funding Information Network, which is a network of public libraries and university libraries where they have a database called Foundation Directory Online, which is really a catalog of searchable catalog of every foundation in the US, plus some international foundations. And you can go into those libraries and actually do research free of charge. Else you have to subscribe to the database online, and that can be kind of a decently expensive proposition, around $1,800 a year. Grants.gov, as Carlos mentioned, on the government side, I mean, is a tremendous one-stop shopping resource. You can find your funding opportunities. You have a whole pre-application portal set up. So if you want to apply, you can upload a lot of your documents. They're tracking more than 1,000 different grant programs. There's standardized grant information application packages. And as Carlos mentioned, there's actually a number of great how-to videos and presentations and slide decks on how to write competitive applications. I mean, they're kind of there to show you how to do it. And the nice thing is, again, through this one-stop shopping resource, once you've applied and uploaded all of your documents through a system called the SAM system, you are in the system, and therefore it makes it really easy to then just be able to, find the grant opportunity, respond to the RFP, write the application, give them the supplemental documents, and you just do it through one portal. And this is something, by the way, that makes it very different than foundations, because you have to just go to foundation. Everything at the federal level will go right through a grants.gov process. And finally, I don't think we can ignore earned income as income stream, even though I know we're talking about fundraising. But some charities do earn revenue. And you may be selling a product, you may be selling a service, you may be charging for participation fees. I mean, so like the YMCA, YMHA, YWCA. I mean, any of these nonprofit organizations have very robust membership programs, and that's a big part of their financial services or their financial stream. And sometimes a startup organization may say, we might be able to charge something for a service or for a product, and that could be part of your revenue stream as well. And as a matter of fact, I have one client that's in a startup mode right now, and they actually do have a product, which is an educational software that they've developed, and that's part of their revenue. Right now, it's the biggest part of their revenue. They're also trying to build out corporate sponsorship, foundation support that would enable them, to keep the fee for this software very modest, ultimately be able to give it away for free. But the earned revenue makes perfect sense for their particular business model. The one thing is, if you're going to do this, you definitely should get a quick legal review on it. I'm not a legal expert on sales of products and services, but I think that it's worth always running it past a good attorney just to make sure that it's going to work in terms of the state or commonwealth where you do business. So we've looked at the case for support. We've talked about finding the right kinds of revenue streams. Another topic we should take a look at is how to set fundraising goals. This is going to be quite a bit less lengthy than the last one that we did. The main thing is, where can you get the best results in terms of fundraising? And that's on the income side. It's a good idea as you're thinking through your fundraising goals, not just to think through how much money I need to raise right now, but possibly, looking ahead, how much do I need to raise maybe next year, possibly even the year beyond. This is pretty important. And when it comes to budgeting, you can set aggressive fundraising goals. Those goals are aspirational. So you can go out to the world and say, we're trying to raise $100,000, and that's going to be our goal. Internally, when you're putting a budget together, you probably should budget for less because, just to be safe, you might not raise the full amount that you're trying to raise. In terms of how you think about how you're raising money and setting goals, I think one of the things you have to really think about is, why am I raising money and how am I going to use it? And I've found that for many of my clients, this little matrix has been very helpful in guiding our conversations on how much money should we be out there trying to raise. So you'll notice that there's really two, if you will, you could call them silos, up and down here. So you have an operating side and a program side. So operating side is all about basically keeping the organization in business. So it's keeping the doors open. It's making sure your core staff get paid. Make sure the utilities are covered. The essential expenses of running your business are covered. The program side basically says, we acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of money out there that ties to what we do. So this is going to be money that will be restricted for the purposes of providing a service, a program, a product, or a service. So a lot of us think about fundraising as operating fundraising and program fundraising. But then, like one day, I was doing some planning with a nonprofit, and in the aha moment we all had was like, we kind of have to look at how much do we need to raise just to keep us in business this year, and that's one number. But if we're able to get that number, where do we go next? So therefore, we're adding really kind of two more, axes, if you will, to our matrix. So you think about basically sustaining funding. So if I am thinking about sustaining my operations, I am just basically trying to cover my basic fundamental operating costs just to stay in business. And for my program, how much is it just do we need to raise just to keep doing the same thing we're doing right now so we don't lose anything next year? But I also need to have something aspirational to say to my donors. So this is where we get into investments. So on the operating side, investments go beyond just your operating expenses. It's basically investing in building capacity. I need additional money to hire staff. I need money to purchase technology. A lot of charities are going through this right now. Capital, I may need money to grow into a new space. So these are basically investment contributions and opportunities for donors. So, you may have donors out there who could give money to really help you move to the next level. And on the program side, it's all about expansion and enhancement, getting larger and getting better. So once you've reached that program maintenance number, every additional dollar might start going into making the program bigger and better. If you have all of these different kinds of expenses, and incorporated into your budget, then you have something for any and every donor that you're going to talk to. I mean, your $20 donor is helping you keep the doors open. Your $2,000 donor might be helping you buy a new computer or something tangible that can make your work better. So if you think about your numbers like this is going to give you really a better product to take out there and raise money. And how are you going to do it? How are you going to raise money? These are the major questions you have to think through. I think every charity has to think through these questions. I think every nonprofit, or excuse me, every startup has to think through them. What are the least effective ways that we can do this? So basically, how am I going to do fundraising most effectively? What is the least time consuming? And what would be possibly the least expensive? So if we look at the different things we do, we need to come up with activities that will speak to the constituencies where we have the most reach. So this goes back to that fundamental question, are we better for foundations? Are we better for individuals? Are we better for government? And at the end of the day, your final decisions on these things is going to be a mix. I mean, honestly, you're going to have some things that you do that are a little more expensive than you'd like them to be, but they could be less time consuming and more effective. So I'm going to walk you through this in fairly short order and maybe help you think through, how to make these decisions. So our fundamental menu of choices when it comes to raising money for most charities is we can do it through the mail. So they call that legacy mail nowadays. But believe it or not, a lot of funders or a lot of donors still respond to actually getting an envelope. Online appeals, that's a given. Individual asks, and what that means is going and talking to a person individually, not through a letter, not through an email, but actually having a conversation. It might be through Zoom, might be in person. Events, that's another way of raising money, and people are still doing it. Organizations are still doing events, but not as much as they were doing them. And of course, something we've been talking about already this morning, which is grant funding. So on the mail appeal side, I think there's like three things I want you to be mindful of. That a lot of large scale fundraising still happens by mail. Mail can be effective. I mean, some people really like having that tangible, tactile, and personal experience of opening an envelope and removing something, but also acknowledging that raising money by mail can be expensive. It's expensive for postage. It's expensive to buy lists. It can be expensive to actually, produce a good mail package and send it out. But the results can be quite good. And these are a couple of numbers that I got from my good friend and colleague Tom Ahern. That basically, if you're using the mail and you're mailing to strangers just to get the first gift, that's called an acquisition mailing, your hit rate's going to be about a half of 1%. So that means that you're going to get a return of 1/2 of 1% in terms of the number of letters that you send out. So for every 100 letters you send out, you're going to get 0.5 0.5 gifts of return. So that means you got to mail out to 200 people to get one donor. On the other hand, once you start getting donors and you mail to them again, so if I mail to Carlos, he's already written me a check and I mail back to him, I've got a 40 to 60% chance of getting him to write me a second check. So acquisition mailings are really where you have to spend money and renewals are largely where you make money. And this is why anybody I talk to in the field of doing these types of mailings will say, generally speaking, you're going to lose money on direct mail at a large scale if you're going to a lot of strangers for about 2 years before you make a profit. Now, a lot of us here are in the startup space. So chances are you may be mailing to people you already know, and it's different. You're not mailing to a stranger, you're mailing to an acquaintance. And even if it's for a first time gift, you may have a higher hit rate. So I wouldn't discount doing some targeted mailing to people who are already on your list. The question is, like, what do you say to them? Here are some basic, how-tos on direct mail. I've tried to get this onto one consolidated slide. And in the resources that we're going to put online for you, there's two tools, if you will. Pamela Grow has written a great basic appeal letter template. So I would take a look at that. And I've also put up an infographic on from Tom Ahern on how to write a fundraising letter. And if you follow that infographic, said demographic, infographic, then chances are you're going to come up with a pretty good, effective appeal. Length of appeals can vary. Sometimes, a longer letter is better. Sometimes a shorter letter is better. And this is going to be kind of hit or miss and trial and error with your group. And so there isn't really a hard and fast rule. The main thing is to think through effective storytelling. Most important elements in the letter is, like, what do you say right up front? I mean, the opening paragraph makes or breaks it. So if you're going to spend your time edit the opening paragraph. Making sure that you ask for a gift. Make sure that you personalize the letter as much as possible. Tom Ahern talks about the word "you" because the letter is about the recipient, and his unofficial general rule is use the word "you" a minimum of 7 times in any direct mail communication. Make sure that in that letter you're telling a story. Don't bore them to death with statistics and facts, and call the reader to action. Make sure that this letter is about getting that person to send money back to make someone's life better. If you can tell that story and tell it effectively, you'll probably do okay. You can also take this same message, these same techniques, and just give it to people online. So, obviously, with online fundraising, the advantages are that you give people appeals that come in real time with real data, and it's really easy. You have to think education, experience, and expression. And basically, I think that with an online appeal, being able to associate the appeal with some sort of a graphical content or interactive content. That means maybe just even taking the donor back to your prospective donor back to your website. That's a great idea because, hey, I'm going to bring you back where I live and let you see what we do. The most important thing is just make sure that, in every turn when someone is interacting with you online, there is an opportunity to give, they call it, just put a big donate button on everything, and make sure that that big donate button is on every single page of your website if you're going to get into this business. And finally, making whatever appeal you're sending out mobile friendly. So making sure that your appeal is going to function on an iPhone or as well as it's going to function on screen. I wanted to share with you a statistic which I think you're going to find very interesting. My colleagues at Blackbaud put out an annual survey of giving. And you're going to notice that when they look at percentage of total fundraising from online giving, for small nonprofits of less than $1 million, 14% of the money comes in from online giving. As you get larger, those percentages tend to drop. So for larger organizations, generally these are ones who have been around for a while and they have donors who are used to giving through the mail. They still give through the mail, but smaller organizations tend to do really, really well in the online space. Another facet of online giving, of course, is crowdfunding. And crowdfunding is fine. I mean, you have to pay attention to things about look and feel and ease of use and how you process payments and, any sites that are going to charge you a fee. So For every dollar you bring in, you've got to give them a certain percentage to process. Making sure that if you are going to get into doing a crowdfunding campaign, that your resource is going to basically wrap around some good marketing social network capabilities, and that basically you are working with a partner who can give you traction, which means giving you exposure. Now, I'm not a funding expert, and this may be something that Tom Watson's probably going to cover a bit more in his presentation. Will be upcoming. But the main things to keep in mind to make it work is that, if you're going to do crowdfunding, starting with no contacts and no audience is going to make this very much an uphill climb. Anyone who talks to us about crowdfunding says you got to come in with a list to prime the pump. So you've got to, have at least, 100 names, 1,000 names of people who are going to know you and can respond and build some enthusiasm. Therefore, you need a network. Your goal has to be achievable. So, doing a crowdfunding campaign to raise $1 million is probably not feasible. You have to pick a number you're going to hit. You need to deliver on what you say you're going to do. This is the other thing: is crowdfunding comes with promises, and it ranges from premiums to we're going to, make a huge change somehow. But you got to be able to follow through, and that you need to report and communicate, which means that just because you put the crowdfunding platform out there, or put your crowdfunding appeal up on a platform, you can't just leave it. You have to tend to it. You have to. It's like planting a flower. You have to water it. So the thing about crowdfunding is it's an easy thing to do, but it can be time consuming when it comes to actually managing it. So the upshot here, and I wanted to introduce this, is that as you're thinking through all of these ways to plan, this is a construct called the Macintosh Way, and I took this from a book called The Macintosh Way by Guy Kawasaki, and he was on the original Apple creation team. And he said we had a really simple matrix when we were inventing the Macintosh: do the right thing the right way. So therefore, all of the things that we're talking about is really, trying to get down to what's the most effective way you can deliver. And that's the same thing for definitely when you get into the world of events. If you want to get into doing parties, that's great. But the main thing you have to think about is experience. This is the core message here. If you can deliver an experience online that people will come and be part of, that's great. But that's usually going to be determined by who's inviting someone to come to the event and what you have to offer them. So I have a client that had an online event a few weeks ago. They moved their ball online. This is the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health. They got a great response, and they got a great response because their keynote speaker happened to be Anthony Fauci. So everybody wanted to come hear what Dr. Fauci had to say. It was brilliant. That brought a lot of people online. But you've got to be able to throw that kind of a Hail Mary pass to really bring people in. So this is one of those things you have to think about. Am I going to be able to do this and pull it off? If not, maybe it's not the right way for me to or be spending time and resources right now. And then with regard to grant writing, and I know there were a lot of questions. I think, excuse me, Elvis, I didn't want to miss individual asks. If you know wealthy people, this is going to be a place where you're going to spend time. You're going to go out and have one-on-one conversations, again, in person or by Zoom. This usually involves a larger gift. So basically, you're giving that person an opportunity to have a conversation, get their questions answered, overcoming risk. You have to think about donors like this as investors, because they're going to want to know, how much do you need? What's going to happen as a result? How much do you want me to give you? And sometimes you might have a donor who wants to know, how can their gift be recognized? These are very hard questions to answer in an online setting or through a direct mail campaign. So this is why these particular donors will have to be asked by you personally. But these are the ones who can write the biggest checks and really drive things on for you and help you grow your charity. Finally, with regard to grant writing, I think the thing that you just have to realize again is that this is a somewhat time-consuming process. These last bullet points are awfully important. If you're going to be competitive in grant writing, you need to have clearly defined your problem and have data to back it up. You have to have clearly defined goals, objectives, and outcomes. So, I mean, you're going to have to do some thinking and planning, an action plan, the ability to gather resources to make the program happen. And you also are going to be asked, particularly in a startup phase, by funders, by a lot of foundations, how are you going to keep this going? How are you going to sustain it? So this is going to be awfully important to think through. So you can already tell that there's a lot of planning work that has to be done before you file that funding application. And a lot of funders are going to want to see documentation like financial statements and budgets, which kind of brings me to, one of the, the toughest things I probably would have to share is that there's a lot of grant makers out there that tend to not fund startups. And it's because startups don't have a track record on with financial statements and budgets. I mean, some funders do, but uh, a lot of grant makers, kind of prefer for you to gain some maturity and have a track record, and then come to them once you can give them an IRS filing, or you can give them a compilation statement of expenses. I'm basically showing them a profit and loss statement. This is why sometimes foundations are not the first place that startups get their toes in the water. They start with individual donors. They might start with government funding before they go over into foundation grants, because again, it's navigating the questions. So when you take all these different kinds of fundraising, and you can imagine there's a lot more that can be said about any one of them. And one of the resources I've provided to you is a reading list where you can access some good books on the topic. They'll give you a deeper dive into all of these different kinds of fundraising. You have to really think through, well, which ones am I going to include? And there's three things I want you to think about: touch, time, and cost. And hopefully these three constructs are going to be helpful to you. So basically, I've taken all these different kinds of fundraising and I put them onto a scale, if you will. Which ones require the most touch and which ones require the least amount of touch. So if you're going to do individual fundraising, that's the highest touch fundraising there is. Even if you're doing it through Zoom, because it's a one-on-one conversation, events can be high touch, and proposals, believe it or not, can be touch, because you're going to have conversations with program officers. When you go over into social media and mail, that's really not high touch fundraising, because these are just basically messages. So, in thinking through all of these, the most effective high touch fundraising are things that are going to be somewhat time consuming for you, which really takes us into the considerations of time. In terms of time, believe it or not, I have visits as least, because visits are periodic, they're episodic. You might visit with 4, 5, 6, 10 funders a year, versus you could be spending a lot of time managing a special event or managing direct mail. So time means how much of your time is going to be consumed by these different kinds of activities, and how much bandwidth do you have. This is why sometimes with small organizations, I might come in and do a development assessment and suggest that they consider not having their special event, because it's just consuming so much staff time, and they're not really raising a lot of money as a result. So time consideration, I think, especially when you're working with limited resources, that's a pretty important consideration. So I would really kind of think through your activities based on, again, how much bandwidth, how much support you have. And then finally, there's just sheer cost. Proposals are probably the most cost-effective way of raising money, because everything's online. You can just fill out an application, hit send, you're done. But if you're going to run a special event, depending on the size of your event, you could spend tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars running an event. And certainly if you're going to mail, you're going to have price of postage. Social media is a lot less expensive, unless you're buying the expertise to manage the social media. And visits, kind of depending on where you're meeting the donor and how you're meeting the donor. So a lot of different things that you have to think through in terms of your resources and which of these different ways to raise money. So finally, the last two things I want to touch upon, fairly quickly, and then we'll have some time for some questions to close out. And I really greatly appreciate your patience and consideration. I know this is a lot to take in on a Saturday morning, and it's great to have the opportunity to share it with you. Team support. This means that thinking through, how do I include the leadership of my organization, our paid staff? Maybe you have consultants, volunteers. These members, these partners are going to vary based on, the charity, its particular reach, and its particular budget. Some of these are free resources and some of them are paid resources. The main thing I would recommend you to think about is starting with the resources that you have. So, assess what you have. It might just be you, like, okay, I'm the resource. Maybe I need to train myself. Maybe I need to learn more about fundraising in order to do the things I need to do well. You might be a charity and you might say to yourself, gee, my audience is going to be talking to wealthy people because I have more access, but I just don't know how to do it. Well, you could be reading books on how to actually sit in a room and ask someone for a contribution. And I've included a really good book on the resource list from my friend Laura Fredericks on the ask. Um, Add resources if you're going to gain experience, expertise, and efficiency. So that means that it's worth considering adding a resource if you're going to get someone to help you who's done something that you haven't done. So the experience can help. The expertise, they know something you don't. Efficiency, they can do it faster, cheaper, and better. Um, my one uh, overarching piece of advice on this is that if you do ever use outside resources, make sure you're going to learn something in the process so that that resource is going to bolster your ability or your staff's ability or your board's ability to be better fundraisers. So it's called knowledge transfer. So make sure that whatever is going to happen by working with an outside vendor or even outside volunteers, that that experience is going to improve your ability to ultimately raise money on your own. Maximizing those resources would mean that you want to, again, focus on the right activities, invest in education and skills development. So one of the things I would encourage anyone here who is, again, in startup mode to do is invest in your own continuing education. So there's a lot of great resources out there, some of them free, some of them might come at a modest cost through groups like Candid or the Association of Fundraising Professionals, where you can just learn to be a better fundraiser, find efficiencies. And again, if you have to consider doing any outsourcing, only do it if you have the money in the budget, or you might be able to get a capacity building grant to pay for it. It's I think you have to kind of find your way to make things work until you can get enough of an operating income to then be able to really invest in building out more ways to raise money and build other resources. In terms of your board, and you're going to see a lot in the in textbooks and online on using the board as partners in fundraising. The board's going to bring all of these things. And Carlos, I know in his first webinar for this group, talked about in terms of just setting up the organization, you have to have a board. But bringing people who can bring vision and passion and connections and also some time to take care of donors and continue to talk to their donors about your great work. This is going to add to the fundraising equation for you. I think that you have to think about how to partner with the board in the way that, to me, I think it always starts with recruiting, bringing people in with a purpose, helping your board understand how much money you really need to raise and what that amount means and how it can get the organization to the next level, inspiring that board to give. One of the questions you'll encounter from foundations is, what percentage of your board members makes an annual financial contribution? You want to be able to say 100%. Then individually, thinking through with each board member how he or she can be most helpful and what they're comfortable in doing by way of helping you to ask for money. I mean, you're going to have some people on the board who are total go-getters. They have no problem picking up the phone or opening up a Zoom call and just asking. And some people just are not as comfortable with it and they may need your help. So spending time trying to figure out how your board will work well in fundraising is absolutely worthwhile. And understanding that over time, as your organization grows, you'll be bringing different kinds of board members on, and those board members will also bring skills and talents and connections as well. Um, then there's finally the action plan, and the main thing I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking through your actual fundraising plan. There's a lot of places online you can get templates and information, and I've also included a list of online resources for you. And my friend Chad Barger at Productive Fundraising, and I have a link to his site, has some great action planning tools for nonprofits. And I would just encourage you to go there and use one of Chad's templates. They're great. The main thing is just understanding what you have to do over the course of a year and not to try to just glom onto everything at first, because you have this balancing act of raising money, but you also have to do the work. um, Noting any kind of recurring periodic activity and using the calendar to set priorities. I'm very big on Gantt charts. I think even something simple and visual like this will help you to understand, what are going to be your busy seasons, what are the times that you're going to be harvesting money through events, what times might be fallow where you're just simply you know communicating with donors or sending out some grant requests. This is why, by the way, I have corporate grant submissions every single month, because that will carry you through in between things like a board appeal or events and things like that. Making sure that whatever you're doing by way of planning, that you're looking at the results. Is This is one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill, and there's quite a few from Winston Churchill. However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And the kind of metrics I would think you might want to take a look at are things like, how are we doing against goals? Do we set benchmarks? How many donors did we bring on board? How many actually gave us another gift they gave last year? How many gave more money? Those things will give you a sense of what's working and what isn't. And also, how many people took your calls? How many people accepted a visit? And maybe they didn't write the check yet, but the fact is, how you may have identified that there are people out there who are receptive to you, and that's important too. That's an important metric in my book. Number of calls or visits completed. Last thing is just there are kind of 5 intangibles I want you to think about. I'm going to get through these pretty quickly, because you can do all the planning and look at all these different kinds of fundraising and read all the books and go to all the different websites that we're providing. But at the end of the day, these 5 things are going to really probably make the difference. Number one, you have to be committed to doing them. Fundraising isn't a maybe thing or a periodic thing. It is kind of almost it is a way of institutional life. You're going to just, if you're going to start a nonprofit, you have to be on board to do fundraising. Spending time building the right team, that's going to take time, and you're going to have some hits or misses along the way. But if you do build the right team, you can build an effective fundraising program. Choosing the right activities, if you haven't figured out, I'm very big on choosing the right activities. Making adjustments, just because you put it into a plan, if something isn't working, um, making the adjustments. Dwight Eisenhower famously said, every battle, you have to begin every battle with a plan, and once you've engaged with the enemy, that plan goes out the window. And being willing to make changes when things don't work. My last quote here is from Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, the first woman who attained an admiral's rank in the United States Navy. And Admiral Hopper said, the most dangerous phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way. And I think that, good, effective fundraising means, doing the things that your gut tells you are going to work, letting go of the things that don't work, making changes where you need to make changes. I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes for some final questions, and I'm going to put this back to Carlos, who's been tracking them. I appreciate your your attention, everyone.
No, extraordinary presentation, covers
Thank you.
a lot of key points, and I love your recommendations of building lifetime relationship, because that's the key to maintain that. That's why outsourcing better is not the best approach, because you have to build this in a way that you can control your donor database, and also controlling the relationship, personal relationship with them, even with the government. Also, you need to build that, uh, because there are people behind those desks that also you need to build those relationships. It's the best way to win also at the same time. We have the first question here. It's about the startup and working with fundraising efforts and not having a strong board. Any recommendation for that?
Oh, okay. So if you don't have a strong fundraising board, I think this is where, um, until you have one, and by the way, I bet you this is might sound a little too obvious, and is that I think one of the things you have to do is you have to, think through what kind of board members do you need in order to have a strong fundraising board. And part of that is thinking about like what constituencies will make the most sense for you. So let me give you an example. I have an organization who is a client, and they are. Here's what how they term it is: we're building our second board. Our first board helped us to get established, helped us to formulate a vision, helped us initially with a few introductions, but we know that really to grow to another level, we're going to have to bring in different kinds of board members. So that CEO, in terms of how he is thinking about fundraising, his number one priority isn't necessarily going to some different constituencies. It is working on trying to recruit at least 3 board members who can get him to corporate connections in the technology industry, the fashion industry, and the education industry. There's different reasons he's chosen these industries. So bringing people on who can help network you to the right people, that's going to be, that's a silo of work for you. In the meantime, if you while you're working with the board that you have, chances are your best on ramps might be, for example, grants, because grants don't necessarily require board relationships. Another might be doing broad online appeals, or even possibly mail appeals. So it's basically, you're going to have to focus on fundraising that is not necessarily driven by relationships from board members, not until you have that kind of board.
All right, good. We have 3 questions that are about the budget, and the first one is how to best balance the use of gift for programming versus overhead salary early in the nonprofit life. Also, we have a question here that is about the ratio of expenses versus a profit for events and galas. And there's a third question that also touch the same kind of area of the question. That is, for new and emerging nonprofit, operating expenses tend to be higher, more than 10%. How
Mhm.
do we handle pushback from donors who question higher expenses? So 3 financial questions.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the first question on balancing program and overhead and operating expense are somewhat related, I think. So basically, when an organization is in startup, what others think of overhead is probably not overhead. Let me just, here's how the simplest way I'm going to look at it is this way. Let's say that you have started up a nonprofit organization and you have the title of executive director. So maybe on paper, your salary is considered to be overhead because you're administrative. The reality is you're the person doing the work. I mean, I have a couple of organizations, I work with, I coach them, or, consult to them. And in both cases, the CEO of the organization is doing like 100% of the program work. So arguably his compensation or her compensation could really be split up is maybe 10% of or 15% of their time might be attending to administrative matters, but we could definitely prove that that person is working hands-on with kids and families. So this is one way I think you have to look at it, is really not by percentage of cost, but by percentage of time allocation. And that's going to help you, by the way, address that operating expense 10% plus, because I would dare say that, let's say someone considers rent to be an operational expense. If you're doing program work in the space, then really maybe 90% of that space cost is one that's associated with program. So thinking through percentages of time and weighting by time is awfully important. And just as an aside, large organizations struggle with this too. And I think sometimes I encounter situations where the accountant that put together the financial statements really didn't take into consideration how much time the administrative staff, or what he or she considered to be administrative staff, was spending actually doing direct service. So I think paying attention to time allocations. I mean, at the very simplest, if you want to try and track this, and even if you have to prove it, put together a really simple timesheet. Could be program, administrative costs, fundraising costs, and just formally or informally track your time on maybe a week-to-week basis, and you're going to get a very quick sense of how much of your time you do spend on program. And that's how I would address that one. As far as the ratio of expenses to profits for galas and other events, I mean, there's a conventional wisdom, um, which means that it's usually wrong, is that if you have an event that somewhere between 85 and 90 cents out of every dollar should be going back to the charity to support the work, and the overhead rate is going to be maybe 10 to 15%. Um, Ideally, it works like that. In reality, you may have events where your profit margin is going to be smaller. Um, those events might be worth doing if, for example, let me give you, I mean, here's a really great case in point in thinking about galas and things like this. Galas are really expensive. I mean, so if you bring in a caterer, you bring in entertainment, you hire a consulting company to run the gala for you, and you could rack up a lot of expenses to run a gala, especially in a place like New York City, not to mention venue rental. Um, and let's just say that gala, the profit margin comes out to be roughly 55%. And you might say, well, gee, that's a lot of money to spend on having a party. And it is a lot of money to spend on having a party. But think of it this way. Let's say you got 1,000 people to come to that gala. And after that gala, you went back to roughly 75 of those people and got those folks to write you another check. And so therefore they had a great experience. You invested in their experience, and that opened the door and created the opportunity for you to go back and ask for a major gift. The follow-up gifts to that event could be enormous. And I think this is, I have a couple of colleagues who run events, and they say, in terms of thinking about the real fundraising for an event, you've got to include the party and you've got to include what happens after the party in terms of the total number. And I think there's some wisdom to that. So that's another way of thinking about it, and hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, and also the level of exposure and
Oh yeah,
advocacy and bringing the big fish to the same pond to have opportunity of good
got to have
fishing.
some bait.
Oh yeah, good bait.
Have a good party.
Good party. Since staff, volunteers, donor, or others may have disabilities, what are some things to consider when fundraising to or with people with disabilities? That also we can include also the area of minorities and diversity in terms of fundraising and other approaches that we need to have in terms of fundraising. That's a good question.
Yeah. So, is this I just want to maybe I'd like to understand the question a little better. I mean, are we saying is this in terms
It's
of
if you have to have any kind of a specific approach,
right?
what kind of approach? Maybe it's a question. So if your organization is an organization
Hmm.
with people with disabilities or the specific fundraisers, there are specific benefits and approaches. I think that let's
Yeah.
go that way.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. Because I mean, I actually work with. I'm proud to work with a couple of charities who work with that serve that community. And I think that what they do extraordinarily well is they tell incredibly empowering stories. I mean, their entire point of view is we are not out there talking about the challenges of individuals with disabilities. We talk about the potential for folks with disabilities. What potential are we unlocking? What opportunities do we have? And I think if you tell an empowering and uplifting story, which incidentally I think in nonprofit that's what we all should be doing, that is I mean, it's an empowering story to hear. It's an empowering story for your team members to deliver. And what's really great is I'm thinking about one organization where I would say that if you of their entire fundraising team, I would say that 70% of their fundraising team is made up of folks with, varying levels of disability. That's they deliver that message extraordinarily well. I mean, I'm going to use a phrase that I was on a call with a team of them, and I was listening in, and one of them said, we think we're good at what we do because we're happy warriors." And I was like, wow, I like that. I mean, it's like they're out there with a mission, and they're out there talking about possibilities and potential. So I think that's the lens that probably works pretty well. Remember, with a lot of fundraising, it has to be inspirational, has to be
Mhm.
aspirational.
Good. Yeah. We have another approach here. It's about the online fundraising. There are
Um,
some. They are. She's asking about the restrictions, the pros, the cons, because you are probably fundraising outside your nonprofit registered city, state, or country.
mm,
So what are the advantage and disadvantage of online fundraising?
well, I think the registration question is a very good one, because I think that and it's one I think that a lot of charities are struggling with some of their the attorney generals in the state or commonwealth where they're doing business. And what this means for everyone is that we're required as charities to register in states where we are raising money, but when you're doing an online campaign, ostensibly you're raising money everywhere. So some charities, have just taken on the challenge and saying, okay, we're going to register in all 50 states and commonwealths. Not being like I'm not going to try and give answers where I don't have expertise. And by the way, if you tune in for the upcoming session with Tom Watson, I would say it's a
Mhm.
great question to carry over into Tom's session. As far as like pros and cons, I think the main thing is that if you're raising money online, making sure that you have something that is experiential for the donor. I think one of the things where online appeals can fall flat is that if the online appeal is entirely two-dimensional. And what I mean by that is that it's just a message in an email blast, and there's no way to. I mean, I think that the appeals that work well is something that gives the recipient an opportunity to go to a place online and see a brief snippet of something, or be able to download something or experience something. um, I think that's the advantage that online gives us, and sometimes charities don't play to that advantage. So I would just be careful to to make sure that you're. I would check the registration requirements, and also just think about how can you use the online platform, or the milieu, if you will, to bring donors into your world.
Good. What is your view about theory of change to support fundraising efforts?
Theory of change to support fundraising efforts. Well, it's interesting. I mean, in my class on grant writing I teach for Columbia, we get to devote like one whopping lecture to this, and probably should be doing more because more funders are asking about it.
Mhm.
I would say that um, one of the things I'm encountering, you guys are probably encountering this too, is when you're dealing with foundations where they have next gen leaders, and especially if a lot of their next gen leaders went to business school, we're being asked to come in and not just talk about the work we do, but to provide our theory of change. And I think theory of change works really well with those particular foundations. And I would say it works extraordinarily well if you have the ability to raise money from entrepreneurs, excuse me, social entrepreneurs and business entrepreneurs. I mean, they respond well to theory of change. Um, depending on how complex your theory of change is, sometimes it can be a nice add-on to some of the public messaging you're doing. But if it's a complex theory of change, sometimes it can confuse more than it can enlighten. So I would just be mindful to try to make it as accessible as you possibly can. So I mean, this is the places I think we're encountering theory of change and having to use theory of change in our work.
Yeah. And there's a well, this is but maybe a better question for Bernarda. Is there any platform to recruit board members? I don't think there is any platform specifically to recruiting board members, but I haven't seen some LinkedIn and some open requests for more members from several organizations and open the cost for all the people who wants to join to this board. But do you have any advice in terms of this? Or
Yeah, I mean, I don't know again of any platforms because it's really not
yeah,
predominantly what I do. I mean, I think there a number of my clients do partner with groups like the Junior League, for example, and I'm thinking almost more like on ramp partnerships with groups like that who are they really educate board members and try to connect them with charities. And then there are some other groups out there who they're consulting groups and not for profit groups that are springing up to provide board connections. As you said, Fernetta will be far more knowledgeable about
yeah,
the
yeah.
specifics of that than I would be.
Do you have any resource in terms of statistics for compounded effects of fundraising mix? For example, direct mail in conjunction with a priming or follow-up call time?
Mm. Personally, I don't. I'm some of the industry associations, like there's the Direct Mail Association (DMA). They may have done studies. I mean, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll just go to the industry groups. Candid might have information, of course, more along the lines of foundation and corporate grantsmanship. But try the Direct Marketing Association.
Good. Can you clarify the point about being registered in every state for national fundraising? We are registered in New York. Can we get donations from donors in other states?
First of all, yes, you can get donations from donors in other states. I'd say that if getting money from a donor in another state is more of a periodic thing, as long as you're not doing fundraising activities extensively in another given state, you're probably okay with it. Where I tend to see organizations go through the 50 state / Commonwealth registration process is if it is an organization that is doing intensive direct mailing into different states. So if you're like dropping 10,000 letters into the state of Arkansas, you probably should be registered in the state of Arkansas. If you're sending a grant proposal to the Charles Fruoff Foundation in Arkansas, like once a year, you don't need to register there.
Yeah. Oh, well, and remember that that is where your base is, and you are doing your operation where your base is, and you're receiving the funds through direct mailing or online is where you are located. And
Correct.
another thing is that you open operation in another state to have some fundraising, to begin fundraising activities there. Thank you very much for your participation today. For us, it has been an honor to be here. John, we learned a lot from you. Extraordinary, clear
Thank you.
presentation, right to the point.
Had a
Thank
great
you
time.
very much for everything. And I
Welcome.
want to invite you to the next event in January 30 with Bernetta. It's going to be an extraordinary presentation to talk about governance and continue the discussions about how to start a nonprofit. Thank you for for all your insight, John. Thank you to
Welcome.
everyone for your participation today.